Evolution had played some rather creative jokes throughout the cosmos, but perhaps none quite so elaborate as the hegemony of Kereth. Here was a species that had mastered the art of quantum manipulation, developed technology that could reshape matter at the molecular level, and constructed a civilization spanning 97 star systems, all while maintaining the collective emotional intelligence of a particularly vindictive teenager. The Karethians had achieved something that lesser species could only dream of. They had turned hypocrisy into an exact science. Their society operated on the revolutionary principle that morality was a sliding scale, with the top end reserved exclusively for themselves and the bottom populated by everyone else in the universe. This wasn't mere arrogance. That would have been too simple. This was arrogance refined through millennia of practice, distilled into its purest form, and then weaponized with the sort of efficiency that only came from treating ethical flexibility as a core competency. Their dominion over the galaxy was maintained through what they called the Benevolent Protection Protocols, a masterpiece of bureaucratic doublespeak that essentially boiled down to, "We rule you for your own good, and if you disagree, we'll demonstrate why you're wrong." The beauty of the system lay in its self-reinforcing logic. Any species that objected to Karethian rule was clearly too primitive to understand the benefits of Karethian rule, which proved they needed more Karethian rule to help them evolve beyond their primitive objections. The Cosmic Tribunal, that grand theater of interstellar democracy, served as the perfect stage for this ongoing performance. Representatives from dozens of species would gather in the crystalline halls of Station Harmony to debate the pressing issues of galactic governance, vote on resolutions that had already been decided, and participate in the solemn ritual of pretending their opinions mattered. The Karethians had elevated this charade to an art form, treating the tribunal with the sort of respectful attention that one might give to a beloved pet that had learned an amusing trick. Into this carefully orchestrated symphony of cosmic governance had wandered humanity, those endearingly primitive bipeds from the Sol system who seemed to have missed the memo about how galactic civilization actually worked. The humans had achieved interstellar travel through what could only be described as a combination of scientific brilliance and suicidal optimism, having apparently decided that the laws of physics were more like guidelines anyway. And what made them particularly amusing was their stubborn insistence on treating the Cosmic Tribunal as if it were an actual governing body with real authority and genuine moral principles. They would arrive at sessions with carefully prepared presentations about resource allocation and conflict resolution, complete with detailed analysis proving that certain policies were counterproductive. They raised uncomfortable questions about civilian casualties, suggested awkward alternatives to military solutions, and seemed genuinely bewildered when told that these matters were beyond current jurisdictional parameters. Ambassador Nathaniel Flynn had been especially entertaining in this regard. The human representative possessed the sort of earnest idealism that made seasoned diplomats want to explain that the universe was far too complex for such simple concepts as justice and fairness. He would stand before the tribunal with his quaint human moral certainties, challenging decisions that had been made by beings who had forgotten more about governance than his entire species had ever learned. The Karethians found this delightful. Here was a species that still believed in concepts like universal rights and proportional response, ideas that more advanced civilizations had long ago recognized as evolutionary dead ends. It was like watching primitive organisms try to understand quantum mechanics, touching in its sincerity, amusing in its futility, and ultimately irrelevant to the serious business of galactic administration. The universe, however, had been keeping score, and it was about to present the Karethians with a rather substantial bill for their millennia of cosmic comedy. The Thornfield Sanctuary had been established in the Kepler 452 system, a modest facility dedicated to caring for orphan children from the human colonial worlds. It represented the sort of project that existed in the margins of galactic awareness, too small to be strategically significant, too remote to be economically valuable, and too innocent to be politically threatening. The kind of place that advanced civilizations might acknowledge in their peripheral vision, but would never consider worth their serious attention. The sanctuary housed 537 children, refugees from the various conflicts that plagued the frontier regions. They lived in simple structures that would have been considered charmingly primitive by galactic standards, learned lessons that would have been dismissed as hopelessly idealistic by species that understood galactic realities, and harbored dreams that would have been considered laughably naive by beings who had learned to think in terms of cosmic pragmatism. The Karethian 3rd Enforcement Division had been conducting routine compliance operations in the sector when their sensors detected the unauthorized human installation. According to their threat assessment protocols, the facility represented a potential security concern. An unmonitored outpost that could theoretically be used for intelligence gathering or strategic positioning. The fact that it appeared to be populated entirely by children was, in the assessment of Division Commander Karethian, an obvious deception designed to exploit primitive emotional responses in enemy psychological profiles. The decision to neutralize the facility was made with the sort of clinical detachment that the Karethians were renowned for. No malice, no particular animosity toward humanity, no desire to cause unnecessary suffering, just a straightforward application of established security doctrine. Unauthorized installations in disputed territory were to be eliminated. The presence of non-combatants was regrettable but not legally relevant under current threat assessment guidelines. The attack commenced at 14:32 Standard Galactic Time and concluded at 14:47 p.m. The Karethian strike vessels approached the facility with the methodical precision they might employ to sterilize a biological contamination site. Their particle beam arrays carved through the modest structures with surgical efficiency, their targeting systems ensuring that no section of the compound remained structurally intact. The children's voices were briefly audible on emergency frequencies before the final bombardment wave reduced even the echoes to silence. When the debris stopped falling and the energy readings returned to baseline, the Thornfield sanctuary was gone. So were the 537 children who had called it home, along with the 114 adults who had dedicated their lives to caring for them. The Karethian strike force departed with the satisfaction of mission parameters successfully achieved, their operation completed according to all relevant protocols and procedures. The galactic news networks reported the incident with their customary professional objectivity. The hegemony of Kareth had conducted a preemptive security action against an unauthorized human military installation in contested space. Casualties were described as regrettable but necessary, and the operation was deemed consistent with established peacekeeping protocols. Several expert analysts noted that the action demonstrated the hegemony's continued commitment to maintaining stability in the volatile frontier regions. The human response was immediate and, to galactic observers, entirely within expected parameters. Ambassador Flynn demanded an emergency session of the Cosmic Tribunal, his voice breaking with what appeared to be genuine anguish as he described the attack as an unconscionable massacre of innocent children. He presented holographic evidence of the destroyed facility, survivor testimonies from the few adults who had escaped the initial bombardment, and detailed documentation proving that the installation had been a purely humanitarian operation. The tribunal's response followed established diplomatic protocols with clockwork precision. Commander Karethian offered the standard expression of regret for any unintended consequences, while emphasizing that Karethian forces had acted within established security guidelines. The Arcturus delegation suggested that humans should consider the risks before establishing facilities in disputed territories. The Centauri representative recommended that Earth submit a formal grievance through the appropriate bureaucratic channels. Ambassador Flynn's concluding statement to the tribunal was delivered with a quiet intensity that should have been recognized as something more significant than standard diplomatic rhetoric. We came to you believing that galactic civilization meant something more than organized brutality dressed in administrative language. We trusted that beings capable of such technological marvels would possess equivalent moral sophistication. We were mistaken. We will not make that error again. The tribunal interpreted this as the expected emotional response of a grieving species. Such outbursts were standard among younger civilizations that had not yet learned to accept the practical realities of interstellar politics. The humans would eventually mature, develop a more sophisticated understanding of galactic affairs, and learn to operate within the established framework, like every other species. They were about to discover that sophistication, like evolution, came in many different forms. The human response began not with declarations of war or mobilization of fleets, but with a profound and deeply unsettling silence. Earth's diplomatic missions shuttered overnight. Human cargo vessels ceased arriving at galactic ports. The regular scientific exchange programs were terminated without explanation. Ambassador Flynn submitted a terse resignation and departed for Earth, leaving behind only empty offices and severed communication links. To the galaxy, this appeared to be capitulation. The humans had finally grasped their position in the cosmic hierarchy and were retreating to their primitive corner of space to nurse their wounds in solitude. The Karethians congratulated themselves on successfully demonstrating the consequences of challenging established authority. The other species nodded approvingly at this display of appropriate submission to galactic realities. What they failed to comprehend was that humanity had not retreated, it had simply stopped pretending to be civilized according to galactic definitions. Deep within the industrial complexes of Luna, in the research installations orbiting Saturn, in the manufacturing facilities scattered throughout the asteroid belt, something unprecedented was occurring. The entire human military-industrial apparatus, already formidable for such a young interstellar species, was undergoing a transformation that would have been impossible to conceal if anyone had been monitoring their activities. The tragedy at Thornfield had accomplished what decades of diplomatic cooperation had failed to achieve. It had unified humanity under a single, burning objective that transcended all previous political divisions. Every colony, every research station, every military installation was now focused on a purpose that had nothing to do with galactic politics or bureaucratic protocols. The children of Thornfield would be avenged, and the galaxy would receive a comprehensive education in what occurred when you made the catastrophic error of targeting the young of a species that had evolved from cooperative persistence hunters. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, director of the Europa Advanced Weapons Consortium, examined the production reports with a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal revulsion. In the 8 months since Thornfield, her facility had increased output by 1,200%. The same exponential growth was being replicated across human space. Every factory, every shipyard, every laboratory was operating beyond theoretical capacity, producing instruments of war that bore no resemblance to the civilized weapons of galactic warfare. These were weapons conceived by a species that had spent millennia perfecting the art of eliminating enemies with whatever resources were available. Kinetic impactors that could penetrate any known defensive system, thermonuclear devices that could destabilize planetary cores, chemical agents that could target specific biological markers, cybernetic viruses that could transform an enemy's own technology into instruments of destruction. But the most terrifying weapons were not the ones that could be quantified in destructive yield or casualty projections. These were the weapons that struck at the fundamental assumptions underlying galactic civilization, the unspoken agreements, the mutual understandings, the comfortable certainties that everyone would follow the established rules, even when losing. The humans, it appeared, had never formally agreed to those rules in the first place. The first indication that something had gone catastrophically wrong emerged when the Karethian monitoring station at Wolf 359 simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed by conventional weapons, erased. One moment it was there, its massive superstructure visible on long-range sensors, its garrison of 15,000 personnel maintaining their eternal surveillance. The next moment, empty space containing only trace amounts of metallic debris. The investigation team that arrived 72 hours later found nothing but a slowly expanding cloud of atomized matter and a single transmission broadcast on all frequencies. Thornfield sends its regards. The second indication materialized when Karethian military installations across 11 systems simultaneously experienced catastrophic power failures. Not from external attacks, from internal sabotage. Human infiltrators had somehow penetrated the most secure facilities in Karethian space and installed devices that converted the installation's own fusion cores into weapons of mass destruction. The resulting explosions were detectable from neighboring galaxies. The third indication was perhaps the most psychologically devastating of all. Karethian civilians throughout the hegemony began experiencing what medical authorities classified as collective neurological disturbance. Vivid nightmares that felt more real than waking life. Hallucinatory experiences of human children pleading for mercy that would never arrive. Auditory manifestations of playground songs that transformed into screams of terror. The humans, it seemed, had discovered how to weaponize guilt itself. By the time the galaxy recognized what was occurring, the critical threshold had been crossed months earlier. The humans had not simply declared war on the hegemony of Kareth. They had systematically catalogued every individual, every facility, every resource that had contributed to the attack on Thornfield, and designated them for elimination through methods that violated every principle of civilized warfare. The assault on the Karethian homeworld commenced exactly one standard year after the destruction of the Thornfield sanctuary. The timing was not arbitrary. The humans had spent 12 months planning, preparing, and positioning their forces with the methodical patience of a species that had learned to hunt by pursuing prey across continents until exhaustion made resistance impossible. The attack defied every established convention of interstellar conflict. There were no preliminary ultimatums, no negotiation opportunities, no provision for the Karethians to surrender with their dignity intact. The human fleet materialized in the system through jump points that should have been impossible to access, ignored all communication attempts, and commenced the systematic annihilation of everything that had enabled the hegemony's military capability. The Karethian home fleet, technological marvel of the Galactic Age and source of terror for countless species, endured approximately 3 hours and 17 minutes of combat before achieving total destruction. Not because the humans possessed superior technology or overwhelming numerical advantage, but because they prosecuted warfare with a ruthless efficiency that prioritized results over reputation, victory over honor, and vengeance over mercy. The planetary bombardment that followed was not the precise, surgical operation that galactic military doctrine prescribed for such situations. The humans had analyzed the attack on Thornfield with exhaustive thoroughness, and they had elected to provide a comprehensive demonstration of how such operations should be properly conducted. Every government complex, every military command center, every propaganda facility that had justified the massacre was reduced to radioactive craters visible from orbital altitude. The message was unambiguous. This was not conquest in any traditional sense, but retribution, delivered with scientific precision. The galactic response followed predictable patterns with remarkable consistency. The Cosmic Tribunal convened in emergency session to condemn the human actions as barbaric and grossly disproportionate. Economic sanctions were proposed with great solemnity. Diplomatic protests were filed through proper channels. Military intervention was discussed in carefully modulated tones behind secure doors. The humans acknowledged all of this with the same profound silence that had characterized their withdrawal from galactic society. They had learned that the galaxy's rules were optional guidelines, that civilized behavior was a luxury that could be discarded when civilization failed to protect the innocent, and that moral principles were apparently negotiable commodities in the cosmic marketplace. The systematic dismantling of the hegemony that followed was not warfare in any conventional understanding of the term. It was a methodical deconstruction of Karethian civilization by a species that had determined that some crimes could not be forgiven, only answered with interest compounded over time. Human forces advanced through Karethian space like a force of nature, targeting not merely military assets, but the entire infrastructure that had enabled the attack on Thornfield. The Karethians' attempts to negotiate were met with a single, inflexible response: unconditional surrender, followed by complete dismantlement of their military capability or systematic annihilation of their entire civilization. There would be no diplomatic middle ground, no face-saving compromises, no procedural solutions. The humans had discovered that the galaxy respected only demonstrable power, and they were prepared to provide a comprehensive demonstration of exactly how powerful a species could become when it abandoned the pretense of civilized restraint. The conclusion arrived not through climactic battle or heroic resistance, but via a simple transmission from the Karethian capital to the human fleet command. The hegemony surrenders unconditionally to human authority. We request immediate cessation of hostilities and mercy for our surviving population. The humans granted mercy. They ceased active hostilities and initiated the systematic process of dismantling Karethian civilization with the same methodical efficiency they had applied to its military forces. Every world that had supported the hegemony's war machine was placed under human administration. Every official who had endorsed the attack on Thornfield was subjected to trial and execution. Every resource that had been employed in constructing the hegemony was redistributed to species that had suffered under Karethian oppression. The galaxy observed with a mixture of horror and fascination as the humans demonstrated that the conventions of civilized warfare were not universal laws, but cultural constructs that could be abandoned when they became inconvenient. They had proven that a species willing to discard the pretense of civilization could accomplish objectives that civilized beings could not achieve. Most disturbing of all, they had accomplished this while maintaining that they were defending civilized principles against barbaric aggression. The new galactic order that crystallized from the ashes of the Karethian hegemony differed fundamentally from its predecessor. The humans demonstrated no interest in replacing the Karethians as the dominant galactic power. They had no desire for imperial administration or bureaucratic control. Instead, they established themselves as something far more intimidating, the species that enforced the moral principles that everyone else claimed to uphold. The Cosmic Tribunal continued its sessions, continued its debates, continued its resolutions and proclamations. But now, every representative understood that there was a species monitoring their proceedings, a species that had demonstrated the consequences of mistaking bureaucratic theater for moral authority and administrative efficiency for civilized behavior. Ambassador Flynn returned to the tribunal 24 months after the collapse of the Karethian hegemony. He assumed his place at the same table where he had once appealed for justice for the children of Thornfield, and he addressed the assembly with the same quiet intensity that had characterized his departure. "We have received a comprehensive education," he stated, "in the galaxy's operational definition of civilization and moral authority. We have adapted our understanding accordingly. We hope that our educational experience will prove instructive to all species represented here." The silence that followed was not the polite indifference that had once greeted human concerns about justice and proportionality. It was the silence of beings who had suddenly comprehended that they had provided the wrong curriculum to the wrong students at the wrong historical moment. In the years that followed, the galaxy discovered that the humans had not merely won a military victory, they had fundamentally altered the operational principles of interstellar relations. The comfortable assumptions that had governed galactic politics for millennia were now enforced by a species that had never fully accepted them as legitimate in the first place. The result was a cosmic community that was simultaneously more violent and more peaceful than it had ever been throughout recorded history. More violent because every species now understood that certain actions would provoke consequences that extended far beyond diplomatic protests and economic sanctions. More peaceful because no one desired to discover what additional lessons the humans had absorbed about the malleable nature of moral principles and civilized behavior. The memorial at Thornfield was never reconstructed. The location where the sanctuary had existed remained empty, marked only by a simple monument bearing the names of the 537 children who had perished there. But the vacant space communicated more effectively than any grand structure could have achieved. It served as a permanent reminder to the galaxy that some species valued their young more than they feared death, and that such species represented variables that should not be included in casual calculations. The children of Thornfield had been avenged, but their memory would influence galactic affairs for millennia to come, because ultimately the humans had mastered the most important lesson of interstellar politics. Sometimes the only method of protecting the innocent was to become something that the guilty would remember forever. And in the crystalline corridors of Station Harmony, where representatives from dozens of species continued to gather for their ritualized debates about galactic governance, they maintained a new understanding about the nature of cosmic civilization. There were species you could negotiate with through established protocols, species you could intimidate through displays of superior force, and species you could safely ignore through bureaucratic maneuvering. But there was only one species that would incinerate the established galactic order to avenge a single orphanage. The humans had ensured that this distinction would never be forgotten.